Hello, everybody. Welcome to another class with WebYeshiva. I'm still David Sedley, and we're talking about the Shemoneh Esrei. Tonight, it's Erev Chanukah, and we're speaking about the Hanisim prayer, which is added in the Amidah and also into Birkat HaMazon. And I guess you could probably subtitle this year The Grinch Who Ruined Chanukah, because I'm going to veer a little bit off the text and try and change some perceptions of Chanukah and what it is and why we celebrate. So I hope you enjoy that. I have some questions, and actually I'm going to answer only some of them. Actually, let me answer them all now at the beginning, and that will ruin the suspense coming on. So in the Tefillah of Hanisim, we say Matisyahu ben Yochanan. Matisyahu, what do we say? I can't remember the words. Hasmonean. Ovanav. Right. I think I'm recording. The recording's in progress, yes. Hasmonean Ovanav. So the question is, who is Hasmonean? I always thought it was Matisyahu, the Hasmonean, and that's why they're called Hasmoneim. But we'll see it's not quite that simple. While we're at it, we can also say, what does Maccabee mean, apart from a New York boy band singing Chanukah songs? But where does the word Maccabee come from? So the answer, we don't really know who or at least there are many opinions as to who or what Hasmonean is, and a couple of opinions about Maccabee. Now, how did the Greeks make the Jews forget your Torah? I'm not going to go into that actually very much. Yaros Dvash and others say because they invented philosophy and Jews started learning philosophy and forgot about Torah. Sure, that's a very often heard trope in yeshivot. I don't particularly think that's what this means, or what the Greeks are talking about, or what Chochmei Yavanit is, so I'm not going to go into it, but that's certainly a possible approach. And also, why does the prayer go on so much about, when we talk about delivering the many into the hand of the few, I understand that is a miracle of, like the 6-Day War, when a small army defeated a large army. I get that. But why do I need to say there, Tmeim biad tahorim, the impure in the hands of the pure, or tzadikim biad rishaim, or zeidim biad askei toratecha? What has the religiosity got to do with how well or not they win the war? Now, if I was joking, nowadays I'd say because the really religious people don't fight in the army, so it's still a miracle they managed to find an army altogether if they're all charedim. But that's not the real answer. I think, and I didn't see this anywhere, but I'm still going to say it anyway. I did see one answer which says that tzaddikim aren't as good at fighting as rishaim, and therefore it's a bigger miracle to have the righteous doing the fighting. I'm not convinced by that. I think fundamentally the war of Chanukah was a civil war of the religious Jews against the assimilated Greek Jews, and therefore stressing that along with the Syrian Greek army, and therefore stressing the righteousness against the wicked, is talking about the extremist Jews against the assimilated Jews. I'm not going to go into that because I didn't find any source that say it, but I think that part of the message of Chanukah is this, and it's not a popular message nowadays. It doesn't fit with a lot of modern concepts, but fundamentally the war of Chanukah was a fight amongst the Jews who wanted to remain true to the Torah and the Jews who want to assimilate more into Greek society and Greek values. And then why does the prayer not mention that the menorah burned for 8 days? We light oil for 8 days because of the miracle of Chanukah, and it's lacking completely from the Siddur. And I'm going to say the answer is, I'll give a couple of other answers, but I think the the Siddur, Hanisim, was written at an earlier time than the Gemara, which talks about Megillat Ta'anit, which talk about the miracle of oil, and that there's two different stories happening in parallel at different times in Jewish history. Okay, I hope that was provocative enough as an introduction. Let's look at some of the sources and see where we end up. So for once, I'm not going to the Gemara and Megillah, but Masechet Sofrim is, I think, well, This is published at the end of in the set of Gemara, but it's really from the 7th century, so it's not the earliest necessarily. But it says, Omrim b'hodaya v'hodad pelaot v'tshuot kohanim asher azitu b'im Mattityahu ben Yochanan kohen gadol v'chashmonayahu vanav. Right, the Masechet Sofrim talks about variations in the Torah and how to write a Sefer Torah, or Megillah and Mezuzah and Tefillin. And anyway, in passing, it says that we say a thanksgiving, and we say give thanks for the wonders and the miracles of the Kohanim that you did in the time of Mattityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol and Hasmonean and his sons, which is the first mention, I think, of the Al Hanisim prayer that we have. Okay, so the words of the bracha. Now, the first bit, Al Hanisim, we say both for Chanukah and for Purim. I'm going to give a pre-Purim share on the other Al Hanisim, so I'm going to leave this mainly for March. Al Hanisim v'ala porkan v'ala kavod v'ala tshuot v'ala melchamot she'asita lavotenu b'yamim hahem b'zman hazeh. We thank you for the miracles, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds, deliverances, the wars you performed for our fathers in those days at this season. I'm not going to explain that, but let's look closely at the words of Al Hanisim for Chanukah. B'imei Mattityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, in the days of Mattityahu, the son of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol. So already we don't know, was Mattityahu the Kohen Gadol, or was Yochanan the Kohen Gadol? Unclear. Hasmonean vanav, right? The Hasmonean and his sons. Now, is Yochanan the Kohen Gadol the Hasmonean? Is Mattityahu the Hasmonean? Is Hasmonean somebody else? Right? And if we look back in the Masechet Sofrim, it sounded like, right, Mattityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol v'Hasmonean vanav. It sounds like that's a different person altogether. When the wicked Greek empire stood against your people Israel, I'm not going to go into the history here, but after the death of Alexander, the Greek kingdom was split into three. There were the Greek Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, and the Egyptian Greeks, and we're talking here about the Syrian Greeks who were attacking Israel at the time of the Greek exile, which wasn't an exile because we remained in Israel. So they came, Lashkicham Toratecha v'laviram michukei ratzonecha. Their goal was to make the Jews forget the Torah and to move the Jews away from the laws of your will. Again, the goal or the outcome, at any rate, of the Greek conquest was mass assimilation of Jews wanting to join with the Greeks and adapt Greek ideals and values and behave like Greeks. That was much more exciting than the old-fashioned Judaism as symbolized by the priests, the Kohanim. So that was the Greek intent. And that's why this is counted as one of the four exiles, but the Jews were not exiled, and the temple was not destroyed. It was just converted into a pagan temple, because that represents what this whole exile was about, that turning Jewish things into Greek things. V'ata b'rachamecha rabim, and you, God, in your great mercy, amadate lehem b'etzaratam, you stood with the people at the time of trouble. Ravta trifam, you fought their fights. Danta edinam, you judged their judgments. Nakamta et nikbatam, you venged their vengeance. Masati giburim biad chalashim, you gave the mighty into the hands of the weak. V'rabim biad me'atim, and the many into the hands of the few. So again, that makes sense from a military perspective. That was a miracle. And then Tmeim biad tahorim, the impure into the hands of the pure. Now, the concept of pure and impure doesn't really apply to non-Jews in this sense. So I think it means the impure Jews in the hands of the pure Jews. Or Rishayim biad tzadikim, the wicked in the hands of the righteous. Again, wicked and righteous are really terms applied primarily to Jews. Zeidim biad oskei toratecha, and the willful sinners in the hands of those who were involved in your Torah. So I think this is describing a civil war. And you, God, made for yourself a great name, a holy name in your world. And for your people Israel, you salvation, great salvation and redemption like this day. So from God's perspective, this victory was a Kiddush Hashem, and from the Jewish perspective, from our perspective, it was a salvation. Va'achar afterwards, Ba'u vanecha ledvir beitecha, your children came into the temple. Ufinu et heichalecha, they emptied all the pagan items that were inside the temple. V'tiharu et mikdashecha, they purified your temple. V'idliku nerot b'chatzrot kodshecha, and they lit the candles in your holy courtyard. V'kavu, right? It doesn't say anything about the oil, 1 day, 8 days, impure. They lit the candles. V'kavu shmonot yemei Chanukah elu, and they fixed these 8 days of Chanukah, leodot ulhalel shimcha gadol, for thanksgiving, praise for your great name. Now you may say to me, it's clear to me that in Hanisim we're talking about a military victory which ended in a defeat of the Greeks by the Kohanim, who then went and rededicated the temple. And Chanukah means dedication because they dedicated the temple. No mention of the miracle of the oil, and you may say, if there's no oil, then why do we have 8 days? Great question. Hold on to your hat. Hopefully we'll get an answer to that one. So let's just take a step back. Who wrote Hanisim? If the Amidah was written by the men of the Great Assembly at the beginning of the Second Temple period, clearly they did not write Hanisim because Hanisim happened toward the middle of second half of the Second Temple period, when there were no longer any men of the Great Assembly. Maybe I saw one opinion that says Mattatyahu was the youngest son of Shimon HaTzadik. I don't know if there's any evidence for that. I only found it in one place. But Shimon HaTzadik was the last of the men of the Great Assembly. So clearly the men of the Great Assembly did not write Hanisim. So either it was written, now who wrote it, I don't have an answer, but either it was written by the Hasmonean themselves at the time of the victory, after they won the war, or it was written later as part of the transition from temple to synagogue. So I saw a suggestion that Yochanan ben Zakkai perhaps composed Hanisim. He made several other decrees after the he was the transition from he was at the time in Jerusalem just before the destruction, moved the center of Judaism to Yavne, and established several practices to remind us of the temple. It's possible that he instituted Hanisim. We don't have any earlier sources. There's nothing in Tanakh, obviously, about this because this happened after Tanakh, after the closing of the canon, the canonization of Tanakh, and anything that would come, anything in the Mishnah, which there isn't, and virtually nothing in the Mishnah about Chanukah, but that is already 200 years later. So there's a gap of 350 years at least in the records of when it could have been written. I don't have an answer, but I think it was both later than the men of the Great Assembly and earlier than the Talmud. So I don't know what the Sefaria describes the Hanisim prayer. And it says the current text of Hanisim is taken from the Siddur of Amram Gaon, right? And he died in 875. And the Siddur of Rasadia Gaon, who died in 942. It is now in the Siddur, both the Amidah and Birkat HaMazon, and it is said daily during Chanukah and Purim and Yom HaTzmaut. Well, that's according to some opinions, both which there are versions, saying the prayer is also mentioned by Achai Gaon in the Shiltot, who lived around 750 CE. So the earliest record we have of Hanisim is the 8th century. And the version that we have is the 9th century or 10th century even, which is a long way to go. We have most of the other prayers are more somehow worded or partly worded earlier than that. Now there is mention of Hanisim in the Gemara, which is 500 CE, but not the specific nusach. The concept of Hanisim is there, but not the specific wording, as we will see. So the Tosefta in Brachot says, for example, Tosefta is 3rd century. Kol she'en bo musaf kegon Chanukah Purim. So any day that doesn't have a Musaf prayer, meaning it's not a festival, it's not Rosh Chodesh, but like Chanukah, Purim, so Arvit, Shachrit, Mincha, Min Palel, Shemoneh, Esrei. Morning, evening, and night you pray the Shemoneh Esrei. Va'omer me'ein ha'menorah b'hoda'ah, and you include some mention of the event in the bracha of Modim. V'im lo amar me'ein ha'menorah, ein machzirin oto, and if you left out that mention, you don't have to repeat the Amidah. So there is a concept already from at least the 3rd century of mentioning Chanukah, but not necessarily the text that we have. Masechet Sofrim, So, which I started with. Here's the longer version. So we say in the Modim Brach, we say Hadata Pelaot Shuot Kohanim Asher Asiti B'Matio Ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol VeChashmoneah V'Lav, right? Which is not anything like our version of Al Hanisim. V'Kein Asa Imanu Hashem Elokeinu V'Elokei Avosenu Nisim V'Niflaot, and similarly God did many miracles for us. V'nodeh l'shimcha lenetzach, and we should give thanks to your name forever. Baruch atah Hashem hatov v'nisim. No, hatov, full stop. V'nisim Mordechai v'Esther mazkirin otam b'hodaya. You also mentioned the miracles of Mordechai and Esther in the Modim. V'shneihem nizkrim b'Birkat HaMazon. You also mentioned them in Birkat HaMazon. So we have the concept of Al Hanisim, but not the wording of Al Hanisim. I'm going to take a little side tour with the question of, do we say Al Hanisim and Musaf? Right? It was very clear in the Braita that you say it at Mariv, Shachrit, and Mincha. Now Musaf, if let's say it's Rosh Chodesh, which is always Rosh Chodesh during Chanukah, or Shabbat, there's always a Shabbat during Chanukah, we have a Musaf prayer. Musaf is not connected to Chanukah. We're saying it because it's Shabbat or because it's Rosh Chodesh. So should we or should we not say Al Hanisim in the Musaf prayer? I know I've gone off from the Siddur, but anyway. The Gemara Shabbat has it as a question. Ibailahu, they asked the following question. Mahu lazkir shel Chanukah b'Musafin. Should we mention Chanukah in Musaf? Here are the two sides of the argument. Kaven delayed by Musaf b'didei, since it's not a festival that has its own Musaf, right? We're not saying Musaf because it's Chanukah. So lomad kirinan, then we shouldn't say it. Musaf is coming. We're saying Musaf because it's Shabbat or Rosh Chodesh, not because of Chanukah, and therefore we shouldn't say it. Or Dilma, or perhaps Yomhu shachayv ba'arba tefilot, that we have an obligation to mention Chanukah every time we pray. And it happens to be this day has 4 prayer services, so we should say it in all 4 prayer services. So Rav Huna for Rav Yehuda, Damri Taveo Eino Maskir. 2 rabbis, Rav Huna and Rav Huda, say we do not mention Al Hanisim in Musaf, and Rav Nachman of Rabbi Yochanan, Damri Taveo Maskir, and Rav Nachman of Rabbi Yochanan say that we do say Al Hanisim in Musaf. And the Gemara then goes into their different opinions and challenges them, and it ends up late hilchata kekol hanishmaita. The halach is not like any of those arguments or refutations. Elakihadam Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rather, we follow the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says Yom HaKippurim shechaliach b'Shabbat. If Yom Kippur falls on Shabbat, so on Yom Kippur we have an extra prayer service of Ne'ilah, which we don't normally have on Shabbat. And Hamit Palel Ne'ilah, the person who prays Ne'ilah, or when we pray Ne'ilah, Tzreich Lazkir Shel Shabbat. Then you have to mention Shabbat, even though the Ne'ilah prayer is nothing to do with Shabbat. So that means that if there's an extra prayer service, you also mention the day in that. So therefore, that shows that Yom Hu Shnirchai Ba'arba Tefilot, that also on Chanukah, if it's a day with Musaf, it happens to be there's an extra Musaf prayer, you also mention Chanukah in that Musaf prayer. Good. So that's in your Siddur, and you'll do that anyway. That's great. Now, in terms of whether we do or do not say Al Hanisim and Birkat HaMazon, we saw the Tosefta that says we do. There is a machloket between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi of whether you must or you may. So the Gemara, the Bavli says, they ask the following question. Mahu lazkir shel Chanukah b'Birkat HaMazon. Should we include Chanukah in Birkat HaMazon? Since it's a rabbinic festival, Lomat Karinan, we don't mention it. It's not on the same level as Shabbat or Rosh Chodesh or a festival. Or Dilman Bishum Pisum Anis, or maybe we should include it because there's a mitzvah to publicize the miracle of Chanukah, and we're therefore madkirin, and we should mention also in Birkat HaMazon, in benching. Amarav Sechora, Amarav Huna, so these rabbis said, Eino maskir, no, don't say Al Hanisim in Birkat HaMazon. However, V'im Ba'al Askir, if you do want to say it for some reason, Maskir B'Hoda'ah, you include it in the blessing of Nodeh Lecha, blessing of thanksgiving. And Rav Huna Bar Yehuda Iklai Lebei Rava, so Rav Huna Bar Yehuda went to Rava's base midrash. Saval Adkoi B'Bonei Yerushalayim, he wanted to say Al Hanisim in the bracha of rebuilding Jerusalem. Amalur Rav Sheshet Ketfila, Rav Sheshet said, no, we do it like we do in the prayer service. Matfila B'Hoda'ah, Af Birkat HaMazon B'Hoda'ah, just as in the Amidah we say Al Hanisim in the Modim prayer, so too in Birkat HaMazon we say it in the Modim, in the Hoda'ah prayer. So the Bavli is fairly lukewarm about saying Al Hanisim in Birkat HaMazon. The halach is that we do say it, but we don't say it in Al HaMechia, right? In the Me'en Shalosh, the blessing that we say after having wine or fruits of the land of Israel or mizonot. We don't include Chanukah there, whereas we do include the Torah festivals. So that's kind of a reminder that the Bavli is not convinced about Birkat HaMazon and Al Hanisim. The Yerushalmi says the opposite. Shimon bar Ba b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, Shimon bar Abba, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Safek hizkir shel Rosh Chodesh, Safek lo hizkir. If you are saying Birkat HaMazon, and you don't remember if you said the Yalev V'Yavo for Rosh Chodesh, so ein machzirin oto, don't repeat Birkat HaMazon. Eshkach Tani or Palik. However, there was an alternative opinion, or disagreeing opinion, which says Kol Yom Sheish Bo Korban Musaf, every day that has a Musaf sacrifice, Kagon Rosh Chodesh v'Chol HaShemoed, like Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, Tzarich Lazkir Mein HaMenorah. You have to include a mention of that special day. V'im lo hizkir, and if you didn't mention it, Machzerin oto, you have to go back and say it again. V'chol she'ein bo korban musaf, and any festival that does not have a musaf sacrifice, Kagon Chanukah or Purim, like Chanukah or Purim, Tzarich Lazkir, you do have to mention them in Birkat HaMazon Mein HaMenorah. But if you forgot to mention it, you don't have to repeat Birkat HaMazon. So the Bavli said you can say it if you want, but if you don't, that's fine. The Yerushalmi says you must say it, but if you forgot, you don't have to repeat it. And the halacha is like the Yerushalmi. Now, why don't we mention the miracle of the oil in Al Hanisim? If you ask anybody why we celebrate Chanukah, they'll say because the one day of oil, one cruise of oil, and that's the only time they'll ever use the word cruise unless they're going on a ship. The one cruise of oil lasted miraculously for 8 days. That's the miracle of Chanukah. It's very surprising then that we don't find it at all in Al Hanisim, which is the prayer about Chanukah. And if we look in the Gemara, right, the Gemara begins, My Chanukah, what is Chanukah? And it quotes from Masechet Tanit, but my Chanukah, the Tana Rabbanan, it's taught in a Braita, B'kafei b'Kislev Yomei de Chanukah Timnai Inu. Beginning on the 25th of Kislev, there are 8 days of Chanukah. Telole misbed b'honut rolit anot behem, you may not eulogize on those 8 days, you may not fast on those days. Why? Shekshe nichnesu yevanim lahechal, when the Greeks entered the temple, Tim'u kol hashmanim shebehechal, they made all the oil in the temple impure. When the house of Hasmonean, kingdom of Hasmonean, overpowered them and defeated them, they looked and they only found one container of oil, which had the stempel, the stamp of the Kohen Gadol, that was still pure. There was only enough oil to last for 1 day. There was a miracle, and they lit from it for 8 days. The Shana Acheret, a different year, which is a strange phrase, Kavaum Vasum Yamim Tovim B'Halal V'Hoda'ah, they made it into festive days with thanking, praising, Hallel and thanksgiving. So the Gemara very much downplays the military victory. It doesn't talk about. It does say that Malchut Beit Hasmonean defeated the Greeks, but it doesn't go on at length about small and mighty and great and wicked or that. No, it's just the main miracle is the oil. That's from the Gemara in quoting Megillat Ta'anit. So that is probably the 2nd century CE, approximately. Now, I saw this on a website that was quoting Rav Aviner, who quoted Rav Kanievsky, so I don't have a source for it, but I took the words there, and anyway, this is what he says. Shema sheshoalim shlo huzkar nes pach hashemen. Your question, why is the oil not mentioned al Hanisim? K'mo Yetziat Mitzrayim. Just like in the Exodus from Egypt, it doesn't mention the miracles in the prayers for Yetziat Mitzrayim. V'chein b'nes pach hashemen haya rak lahem to'elet shikaimu mitzvah shavua kodem. The miracle or the benefit of the oil was that it lasted for a week. That's what we say, for the sake of Israel, we did it like this day. Meaning, the miracle of the oil was so that we will celebrate Chanukah. It wasn't something that the people at the time needed. The halacha is, if you're in the temple, there's no backup. It takes 8 days to make fresh oil, because it takes 7 days to purify the person who's going to make the oil. Right? If they've come into contact with a corpse, they have to be sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer on days 3 and 7, and then at night after 7 they become pure, so they can only start making the oil on the night of the 7th, which means you can only use it on the 8th day. That's why we need 8 days to make pure oil. The halacha is, if there isn't any pure oil available, you may use impure oil in the temple. So the whole miracle of the 8 days of oil was completely unnecessary. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky says that the reason for the miracle was for us nowadays. They didn't need it back then in the temple, but we need it now as something to celebrate, and therefore it's for us, not for them, and that's why we don't include it in Al Hanisim, because it's not relevant. It was not relevant for the Hasmonean that they had the 8 days of oil. A different website I can't remember quotes Ari Pomeransky. I don't know who he is. He has a sefer called Emek Bracha, which I couldn't find on HebrewBooks.org and didn't want to go and buy it. But he says, they quote him as saying, Gon Ari Pomeransky is outside Osek b'zeh b'sifro hanifla Emek Bracha. He says, Marich lasbir ki b'Chanukah yashtei nisim shonim. Chanukah had 2 separate miracles. Haya neshel nitzachon al Yevanim. There was a miracle of victory over the Greeks. Rabim biad me'atim, right? The few defeated the many. Vaya et nes pach Hashem, and there was a separate miracle of the oil. Meidach b'Chanukah yeshem shtei takanot shonot. Also on Chanukah, there are 2 different decrees, right? They said the days of Hallel and Hoda'ah. So yesh din shel Hallel v'simcha, shtiknu lamar Hallel v'smach b'Chanukah. There is the decree to celebrate by saying Hallel and being happy on Chanukah. And there's another rule to light the candles for 8 days. 2 different parts of Chanukah miracle and 2 different parts of the Chanukah commemoration. Din Hallel ne'emar rak makom she'anu ro'im et gvurat Hashem v'tovat Hashem. We say Hallel when we see God's might, God's goodness. Klamar rak al tvar she'Hashem asa tvar shu me'al hateva, when God does something supernatural. In that way you can see directly God's strength. That's when we say Hallel, when we see a clear miracle from God. Many times God helps us, and we don't say Hallel. And the reason is, if the help comes in a natural way, but we believers know that everything comes from God. They didn't establish Hallel for something that looks like a natural event. Because you don't sense God's might. The miracle, the victory in Chanukah, was a supernatural miracle, and therefore they established celebrating with Hallel and rejoicing for that miracle. Al Hanisim, and that's why we say Al Hanisim, which is thanksgiving. Right? That God, you defeated the Greeks, allowed the Hasmonean to defeat the Greeks. It wasn't a natural victory. You gave the strong to the hands of the weak and the many into the hands of the few. So it was clearly a miraculous victory. Right? And there were two results from this. You made a great name for yourself in the world. And the Jews were saved. So that's the goodness of God. So Hallel and prayer and Al Hanisim, thanking God, are all for the victory, for the miracle of the military victory. Me'idach, on the other hand, Hadlakat Nerot Tignu Rakal Nespach Shemen, lighting candles commemorates the miracle of the oil. Shazeh Amarnu Hayanes Shim Me'alateva. This was a supernatural miracle. Shashemani speak the Shemoneh Yamim. The oil lasted for 8 days. Now, I read this about 3 times. I'm not fully sure that I understand that it makes sense what I understand he's saying 2 kinds of miracle, 2 kinds of celebration, great, but I'm not sure why Hallel goes with why the military victory was a bigger, more obvious miracle than the oil. As I said, I couldn't see it inside in his words because I didn't have access to it, and I couldn't quite figure it out. But anyway, this is how it was quoted. So the lighting of candles corresponds to the supernatural miracle of the of lighting the oil. And so that lasted for 8 days. So therefore, Al Hanisim is, we say that for the military victory, and then Hanerot Halalu or whatever Mauso we say for the victory of Pach Shemen. No, okay, great. It's a nice division of why we have 2 different versions of the Chanukah story, but it doesn't really, it explains without answering. Meshech Chochma, Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, 19th century, also the author of the Or Sameach, he also talks about these 2 different kinds of miracles that happened. Lekach al Nes Chanukah, ein hayom moreh rak al hadlaket shemen, zayit v'chinuch beit Hashem, v'tarato v'ashkach elokim al amot beit Yisrael. The miracle of Chanukah today is the lighting of the oil, rededicating the temple, God's supervision of us, when there was no prophet, visionary amongst the Jews. Even so, right, even in the darkness, God looked after us. And therefore, we light nowadays to remember the miracle that happened in the temple. Most people didn't see it. It wasn't a well-known thing. At the time it happened, that they lit the oil for 8 days. Because the leaders then, and the military leaders were the Kohanim, or the Kohen Gadols, the Hasmonean, because they were concerned that if they said, let's celebrate this festival now because we've won a victory, people would think, you guys are just so full of yourselves, you think you did the victory, that you're so smart. So the oil, 8 days, showed it was a miracle from God, and not because of their better tactics or their better skill or anything like that. So therefore, so God showed them a miracle that only the Kohanim would have seen this miracle, right? Because the menorah is lit inside the closed part of the Kodesh, so no Yisrael would have seen the oil burning, only the Kohanim, and it was to show them, to show them that the miracle was done by God. Don't think you guys are so smart and so clever at fighting wars. It was all God. And God watches over them in a supernatural way. Right? There's no prophet telling them that it was God, so God showed them a miracle of the oil to remind them it was God. Okay, those are the from answers. If I have time, I'm going to come back to my answer afterwards. I want to talk about who is Hasmonean. So, Netanyahu Benah says, B'Siddur Avodat Yisrael, page 101 of the Siddur Avodat Yisrael, he says, Yesh Safek im hu musav al Mattiyahu or al Yochanan. It's unclear whether the word Hasmonean refers to Mattiyahu or to Yochanan. Well, if you're Rambam P'tichato Mishnah Perek in the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, HaTorah Kohen Gadol Musav al Mattiyahu, it's clear that Mattiyahu is the Kohen Gadol. Now, we'll see that source in a minute, and I'm not sure it's clear to me like that, but anyway. V'cheinu b'ma'amar Yerushalmi v'ilmedenu, and it says similarly in the Yerushalmi and in the Yalkut Shemoneh, Midrash Tanchuma, sorry. Shehetik Even Yarchi b'Hilchot Chanukah, that Even Yarchi, who is, I think, a Provençal rabbi, medieval, I don't remember his years, he writes in Midrash Chanukah. So they're saying that the Kohen Gadol is Mattiyahu and he's the Hasmonean. Aval Rav Meiri b'tichato leMasechet Avot, but Meiri wrote a commentary on Masechet Avot, also a Provençal rabbi, medieval, and he says, K'tav ki Yochanan Kohen Gadol shever Hagat HaMaaser. It refers to Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who's mentioned in Masechet Maaser Sheni, who aviv shel Mattiyahu Hasmonean. He is the father of Mattiyahu Hasmonean. So we should read it as Mattiyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So Mattiyahu is the son of Mattiyahu is the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and then Hasmonean Vanav. Hasmonean goes back on Mattiyahu. He's the Hasmonean. V'im ken musav Torah al Yochanan. V'ken ketav ba Yisrael olam. Sorry, then the Hasmonean is also going on Yochanan. Sorry, not what I just said. Mattiyahu, who is the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hasmonean. We don't know what the word Hasmonean means. Let's start with that. So maybe it means they're from the town of Chashmon, and the Hasmonean. The ending of I. It's not Hashmonai, right? It's Aleph Yud. It's not Hashmonai, but it's Hasmonean, like Ganai or Banai. When you have the Aleph Yud read as an I sound, that normally means that someone's profession. A Ganai is a gardener, but Banai is a builder. A Shammai is an assessor. So Hasmonean should be somebody who does Chashmon, but we don't know what Chashmon is. So perhaps it's a place, because in Yehoshua we find there's a place, Chatzer Gedev Chashmon, or Beit Palat, there's a place called Chashmon. Maybe they're from there. Similarly in Bamidbar, it says V'yisom, this is a place. So Yehoshua is a place in Israel. In Bamidbar, it's a place in the Sinai Desert. V'yisom mimatka v'yachanu b'Chashmona. They traveled from Matkah to Hasmonean. Maybe they're from there. Seems a bit strange, but okay. So we don't know what the word Hasmonean means. The very last slide, I'm going to come back to another thing of maybe what it means, but it's not clear what it means. And then, so if Yochanan was the Hasmonean, the Avudraham explains like that. Pirosh Yochanan HaMochaneh Hasmonean. Hasmonean was another name of Yochanan, right? He also known as Hasmonean. It doesn't say what it means, but it was Yochanan's name. So it's Mattiyahu, the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who is also called Hasmonean. The Rabbi Yakar, another medieval French commentator, Enamrim v'Chashmonean, right? It's not Mattiyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol v'Chashmonean, like in Masechet Sofrim. Ki hu Yochanan, hu Chashmonean, because Yochanan is Chashmonean. Kedam b'Sefer Yosifun, like it says in Yosifun, which actually is not Josephus at all. It's my bad translation. Yosifun is a medieval book purporting to be an ancient Roman text. The Gemara in Megillah says, "B'medita Tana, v'lo ga'altim b'mei Yevanim." Right, it goes through 4 exiles. It says God did not hate us in the time of the Greeks. Shemadtem Shimon HaTzadik. You established Shimon HaTzadik, v'Chashmonean Vanav, and Hasmonean and his sons, or Mattiyahu Kohen Gadol, and Mattiyahu the Kohen Gadol. So it seems like Hasmonean here, with his sons, is somebody separate than Mattiyahu. and Matziyahu was the Kohen Gadol, but also Shemoneh Tzaddik was also the Kohen Gadol. That's a Gemara. And Rashi says, Dvar Acher, right, in Dvarim, and the bracha that Moshe gives to Levi. Moshe saw that in the future, Hasmonean and his children would fight against the Greeks. He prayed for them because they would be few in number. There were 12 sons of Hasmonean and Elazar, up against hundreds of thousands of Greek soldiers. So that's why Moshe gave this bracha to Levi. So the 12 sons of Hasmonean, Matziyahu is left out, or Matziyahu is Hasmonean. Unclear what Rashi means over here. Ma'aseh Chanukah, we have Amar Rishon ben Yochai. That should be Matziyahu. No, sorry. Bat Haita La Matziyahu Kohen Gadol. Matziyahu had a daughter, She'ein Kiafia B'chol Ha'olam, and she was the most beautiful woman in the world. And she was engaged to one of the sons of Hasmonean. So clearly, Matziyahu and Hasmonean are two different people, because he wouldn't marry his daughter off to his son. And Dikdukei Sofrim says, Hamadata lehem Yochanan ben Matziyahu Kohen Gadol. Right, it should be Yochanan ben Matziyahu. This is on the Gemara Megillah. It's Yochanan ben Matziyahu who is the Kohen Gadol, b'makom lehem Shimon HaTzadik v'Chashmonean, and not Shimon HaTzadik, because that timeline doesn't make sense. So, who is Hasmonean? Either it's Matziyahu or it's somebody else. Yeah, those are the two choices. Either it's Yochanan or Matziyahu or somebody else. Now, this is what Josephus says. Let's just look here. At this time, there was one whose name was Matziyahu, who dwelt in Modi'in, the son of Yochanan, son of Shimon, the son of Hasmonean. So it turns out that Hasmonean is the great-grandfather. It's their family, it's their surname, their last name. Right, a priest of the order of Yorav and the citizen of Jerusalem. He had 5 sons: Yochanan, called Gadus; Shimon, called Matthias; Yehuda, called Maccabeus; Elazar, called Oren; and Yonatan. So Yehuda, for some reason, is called Maccabeus, according to Josephus. All these names, I don't know why any of these names mean anything. But so when we say Judah Maccabee, that's his nom de guerre. Now this Matziyahu lamented to his children the sad state of their affairs, and the ravage made in the city, and the plundering of the temple, and the calamities the multitude were under. And he told them it was better for them to die for the laws of their country than to live so ingloriously as they then did. So we see that Hasmonean then is the family name, and Maccabee is Yehuda's name for war. So I'm still news against the few, but also this is still who's Hasmonean. So Midrash Chanukah says, Yochanan Kohen Gadol Amar, Yochanan said, Ani Shlosha Beni, right, me and my 3 sons, V'ata Hasmonean v'shiva banecha, and you Hasmonean with your 7 sons, that makes Yud Bet Yachad, together we're 12. Connected Yud Bet Shvatim, corresponding to the 12 tribes, we can all fight together. So that sounds like Hasmonean might be Matziyahu, or it might be someone else entirely, and Matziyahu is not involved in the story. Unclear. And if Matziyahu had 5 sons, and here this Hasmonean's got 7 sons, it doesn't add up. Megillah Antiochus, again a much later text. Achrei ken yatzu chamisha b'nei Matziyahu. Afterwards, the 5 sons of Matziyahu, Yochanan v'arba echav. Yochanan has 4 brothers. V'yilachamu ba'amim v'yargum behem hereg rav. He fought against them and killed many of them. V'yagashum le'ayam, kicked them out to the foreign parts. Ki betchu belokei hashamayim, because he trusted the Lord of Heaven. So here it seems that Matziyahu is the main person in the story, as opposed to in the previous version. And who was Yochanan Kohen Gadol? So the Rambam says, as had been mentioned earlier, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, v'hu Yochanan ben Matziyahu, Yochanan the son of Matziyahu, Hanisim b'tefilot b'milchamot Melchei Yavan, mentioned in davening, in the prayers, and the wars against the Greeks. So here Yochanan is the son of Matziyahu, whereas our tefillah says Matziyahu is the son of Yochanan. So presumably there were 2, that Matziyahu named his son after his father. which is what it says over here. Beno Mattiyahu, Kmosh Nizkar b'Tfilot, right? His son is Mattiyahu. Matu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hasmonean. V'tonama Yochanan Shnikra Hasmonean. Yochanan, who's called Hasmonean, Vaya Aviv Shel Mattiyahu. He was the father of Mattiyahu. V'chein b'Yisod Olam. V'chein Per Kamet Megillah. Shimon HaTzadik uMattiyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hasmonean Uvanav Shamdu Yishar b'Yemei Yefanim. So he's got a different version of the Gemara in Megillah, where Hasmonean refers to Yochanan. Perek Yesh Nochlim Nireh Shaya b'Yemei Yanai Hu v'Beno Kshehekdishu Nechasav V'Zeh Tema. In Bava Batra, it seems they lived in the time of Yanai. That doesn't make any sense because they lived 100 years earlier than Yanai. And just to finish up the story, Torah Rishonim, Acharon Me'achim Hashmonaim, the last of the 5 sons of the Hashmonaim, we're assuming now this is the 5 sons of Mattiyahu, is Shimon. Acharei Asher Zachar Lirot Memshala Kavua B'Yehuda. Shimon was the last Hashmonai, and he merited to see the Jews restored to their kingdom. He became the first king after this Greek exile, which of course was his downfall because he's a Kohen and should not have been the king. They complete victory over the enemy. When he reached the pinnacle of happiness, and everyone voted to make the Hasmonean into the leaders, to make him the leader and to make it inherited to his children forever. Nafal Chalal Tachet Yad Ben Afel, he was killed by a terrorist. Al Kiso Yashav Beno Yochanan Horkanes. So then his son Yochanan Horkanes took over from him. You see already his son Yochanan has a Greek name of Horkanes. Ayador B'Shem Yochanan Kohen Gadol is known as Yochanan Kohen Gadol. And only one generation after that, we have Aristobulus and Horkanes, the 2 grandsons of Shimon, fighting out who's going to be in charge, which leads to the destruction of the temple by, Herod taking over and the destruction by the Romans. Okay, so the same thing over here. I'm going to skip all this. Very quickly, what does Maccabee mean? Because I'm running out of time. So Shnei Yochanan Hayu, he says there were 2. This is Siddur also Tefillah, a commentary on the prayer, on the Siddur. There were 2 Yochanans. Echad Aviv Shematziyahu Kohen Gadol, v'hu haya tzadik gamur mirosh v'ad sof. Matziyahu's father was called Yochanan, and he was completely righteous from beginning to end. Matziyahu haya lo ben hanikra Shimon. Matziyahu had a son called Shimon. V'Shimon haya lo ben hanikra Yochanan b'shem avi aviv. And Shimon had a son called Yochanan, named after his grandfather, a great grandfather. V'Yochanan zeh haya lo ben hanikra Yanai, and Yochanan had a son called Yanai, Alexander Yanis. V'Yochanan hasheni nechlekua Abaye for Rava, and Abaye and Rava argue about whether the second Yochanan was good or bad. Abaye sav hu Yanai hu Yochanan v'haya rasha me'ikaro. Abaye says that Yanai and Yochanan are the same person or are equivalent, and therefore Yochanan was bad from the beginning. V'alav amru shara Yochanan kohen gadol shimesh b'kehuna gadola shmonim shana v'lo sofna tzaddoki. About him, it says he served for 80 years as Kohen Gadol and then became a Sadducee. For Rava Sava de Gam Yochanan Shnei Haya Tzadik Mikaro, whereas Rava says that the second Yochanan was also a tzaddik his whole life. Elisha Beno Hanikra Yanai Hu Haya Rasha Mikro, but his son Yanai was wicked. Okay, there's a lot of names there, a lot of family trees, a bit confusing. Basically, it's unclear who Hasmonean is, and who Yochanan is, and even who Matziyahu is. And wait, I just did that twice. I don't know why that is there again. Because I meant to say, ignore the English. That's what I meant to say. Hasmonean, Ilo Hashem Chashivotam. They're called Hasmonean because they're important. We'll see that soon. Or Banav Hayu Kotfim al Tiklam Tevad Maccabee says that this is not the Vilna Gaon, is it? This is the. I think it's a mistake. I think there's also the Siddur, Otzot Tefillot. They would write on their flags the word Maccabee. Some say this is the abbreviation, acronym for the phrase, who is like you amongst gods, God. V'yesh omrim shu Notrikon Mattiyahu Kohen ben Yochanan. Others say it's an acronym for Mattiyahu the Kohen, son of Yochanan. V'asu zod lezecher avim atzadik. They did this to remember their father. So Maccabee should have little chupchiks in it because it's an acronym for something which is not completely compelling. I know people say Maccabee means hammer, but it doesn't mean hammer anywhere else, so that's also peculiar. Now I want to end with a couple of other versions of the Chanukah story. I said that Chanukah is not in Tanakh, which is true, but it is in the Apocrypha. So actually, I'll start with Psikta Rabbati, which is a later rabbinic writing, Mizmoshia Chanukah Dabai David, a commentary on Tehillim. Lama medlik nerot b'Chanukah. Why do we light candles at Chanukah? Ela b'shash nitzchu banav shel Hasmonean gadol, Kohen gadol malchut Yavan. When the children of Hasmonean, the Kohen gadol, defeated the Greek kingdom, Shnema va'arata banecha Tzion al banecha Yavan, quoting a pasuk in Zechariah. When they did it, nechnesu lebeit hamikdash, they entered the temple. Matzu sham shmona shiputim shel barzel. They found, right, the Greeks had carved off the menorah, so they took 8 stakes, iron stakes, v'kavu otam, and they stuck them in the ground, v'idliku b'tocham nerot, and they lit their candles there. Inside, instead of the menorah, they had to use a temporary metal contraption. V'lama korenet halel. Why do we say halal on Chanukah? Mimnei shekatav kel Hashem v'yer lanu. Because the pasuk in Tehillim says that God lights the way for us. So Psikta Rabbati has no mention of the oil. 8 days they came and they lit. They had no menorah, so they made a new menorah and they lit it. Boom. Interesting. So we have Book of Maccabees. There's 4 books of Maccabees. The last 2, forget about them. The first 2 are part of the Apocrypha. The Catholics have it in their Bible, the Protestants don't. The Jews definitely don't. They're written in Greek, not in Hebrew, and unclear how authoritative they are. But anyway, this is a different version, probably earlier than the Mishnah and the Talmud. So I'm going to read the English, actually, because they're from the Greek. Then Judas appointed certain men to fight against those who were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. In other words, after he has defeated the Greeks, he comes to the temple and he gets people to start cleaning up, purifying the temple. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleanse the sanctuary and bear out the defiled stones into an unclean place. Right? They took away all the impure stuff, and when, as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profaned, right? The altar now, what do they do with that? They thought it best to pull it down, lest there should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it, wherefore they pulled it down. Knock it out, take away the temple, take away everything the Greeks have used. Laid up the stone in the mount of the temple in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to show them what should be done with it. Right? They don't have a hotline to God because there's no prophet, so they decided they'll put it away. And then they laid up the stones. They took whole stones according to the law and built a new altar according to the former. So they rebuilt a brand new altar and made up the sanctuary and the things that were within the temple and held the courts. Right? Again, rebuild everything from new. They made new holy vessels into the temple. They brought the candlestick, the altar of burnt offerings, incense, the table. Everything's new. Upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps are upon the candlesticks they lighted. They might give light to the temple. So again, no miracle of the oil. They just they built a new menorah and they lit it. Furthermore, they set the loaves upon the table and spread out the veils, finished all the works which they had begun to make. So they've reset everything, and now on the 5th and 20th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up betimes in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. So they finish purifying, rebuilding the temple on the 25th of Kislev, and they make Chanukah, they rededicate the temple. Look at what time and what day the heathen had profaned it, even and that it was dedicated with songs and citharns and harps and cymbals. And then they fell down and worshipped God. And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. Moreover, Judas and his brethren with the whole congregation of Israel ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year, by the space of 8 days from the 25th day of the month Kislev with mirth and gladness. So they established, for some reason, an 8-day festival. Now I'll tell you the reason, for nothing, because they wanted it to be like Sukkot, which is also a celebration, and that lasts for 8 days. They wanted that same thing. We see that in second book of Maccabees, later and less authoritative than the first, but still, we haven't got much else. So Judah Maccabee and his followers, again, they come, they rebuild the temple, they pray, 25th of Kislev. It says here in verse 9, they celebrate it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivory wreath, wands, and beautiful branches, also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to God, who had given success to the purifying of God's own holy place. They missed Sukkot when they were fighting the Greeks. Now they've got a chance to celebrate Sukkot. They did an 8-day festival. Again, no mention in the book of Maccabees about the miracle of oil. So I want to suggest that the Talmud and Megillat Tanit and the Talmud focus on the miracle of the oil, because it is not appropriate at that time to talk about a rebellion and defeat of an enemy, and it's not a good message they want to have, to say that we defeated the guys trying to get us. Not a good message in Bavel under the Zoroastrians, not a good message in Israel under the Romans. So they kept that bit on the quiet, and they highlighted this miracle of oil burning for 8 days. Now, I'm sure it did, but we have, like, for example, in Book of Kings, we have a story of oil. Elisha and the widow, her oil lasted forever and ever, so it's a nice miracle, and it makes it a much safer festival. But Al-Hanisim was written at the time of the destruction of the temple, when they wanted to have some kind of pride and hope, and therefore it focuses on the miracle of the victory. Josephus also forgets to mention anything about the oil, the miracle. Hasmonean mentioned in Midot. There's a gate, a place where they put the stones of the altar which had become impure. I just want to finish with another meaning of Hasmonean, which is from Tehillim. It says, Yatayu Hashmanim, meaning Mitzrayim. Nobles shall come out of Egypt. Kush teritz yadav le'elokim. Ethiopia stretched out her hand to God. Memechut haaretz shiru le'elokim. All the nations of the world will sing to God. Zamru Hashem, Selah, sing to God, Selah. So here, Hashmanim means important ones, or nobles, or important people, and they are going to come to celebrate God along with all the other nations of the world. So Hashmonaim might mean a title meaning, a noble, or a duke, or an earl, or something like that. That's it. Have a wonderful, happy Chanukah. I think, is there a class next week? I don't remember. I think it's a class next week. I think there is a class next week. So we'll continue with the Amidah. I think we'll finish the Amidah at the end of January. I'll take a break for February and come back in March to talk about Hanisim of Purim and some other things. So happy Chanukah, everybody. No, I think
happy Hanukkah. Thank you.
Happy Hanukkah.
Next week's the last day of Hanukkah.
Thank you for your hard work.
Check the schedule. All right.
Thank you so much. Hanukkah Sameach.
Chanukah Sameach.